Here in China, the US company Airbnb goes by the name Aibiying. I think our next guest will help me if I mispronounced it. That means welcome each other with love, which is not exactly the kind of reception the company has been receiving in this tough market where it faces fierce competition. Last month, our next guest, who co-founded the company, announced he would become chairman of Airbnb's China arm, spending half his time in this market and making monthly trips from the US. To tell us how that's going, please welcome co-founder and chief strategy officer of Airbnb, Nate Blecharczyk. Hi, Nate.
Adam, how are you?
Good, thank you. So I think I proved that we have equal opportunity and difficult names to pronounce, not just with Chinese names, but also with...
We both have Polish surnames, yes.
Yes, that's right. And before our conversation gets started, I just want to remind you, toward the end of our time, I'll ask you if you have any questions for Nate. We'd be very pleased if you would participate from the floor and ask him better questions than I'm going to ask. Okay. Nate, take a moment before we get to China and tell everybody your role in starting Airbnb and your job.
Sure. Well, my background is on the tech side. I got started at a young age. At 12, I taught myself how to code. By age 14, I had my first business. I made almost $1 million in high school. Went on to study computer science at Harvard. Fast forward a couple of years. In 2007, I moved out to San Francisco from Boston and found 2 roommates through Craigslist. And we had this great apartment in San Francisco when suddenly the rent on our apartment was raised 25%. And I said, that's too expensive, I'm moving out of here. But my 2 roommates, Joe and Brian, wanted to stay. However, they had just quit their jobs to become entrepreneurs, also known as unemployed. So they didn't have any money either. But they're both designers by background, and they saw that a design conference was coming to San Francisco. They saw that all the hotels were sold out. And so they got the idea to rent out that extra bedroom that I had vacated to designers who might need a place to stay.
You facilitated the company happening by making room.
Yeah, a lot of serendipity there. But they ended up hosting 3 designers, making $1,000, all going to the conference together, having a really great time. And that was really the inspiration for Airbnb. And so, based on how well that one weekend went, the 3 of us got together in early 2008 and said, let's do this for other people, other situations. And that was 10 years ago. To date, we've had over 250 million guests stay in other people's homes, 4 million homes around the world. And my role originally was CTO in building the site and building up the team. Today we have over 1,000 engineers. I've hired folks better than myself to manage that. And I'm operating in the strategy capacity, so looking at kind of new opportunities for the company.
We have a room full of entrepreneurs who I think are always interested on how successful entrepreneurs operate. I know you talked about your technical background, their design background. Talk briefly about how the 3 of you divided responsibilities early and now.
So yeah, we have really complementary skills and also just very different perspectives. We like to say Airbnb is the combination of art and science. That can come with a fair amount of conflict, to be honest. We often see things differently, we often disagree, but very early on we developed a respect for each one another's different perspectives and realized that if we take the time to talk through our different perspectives and reach a compromise, that those are always the best solutions. So it wasn't always easy, but I would say we wouldn't be here if it weren't for having those very different skill sets and very different perspectives.
Okay, I want to ask what will seem to be, to everybody, maybe including you, an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyway, which is why China?
So Chinese travelers are the biggest spender on international tourism. It's at this point double or triple that of the United States or Germany, which is number 2 and 3 respectively. So it's a huge outbound market. So that alone is a reason to prioritize it.
Now, to be clear, outbound market means Chinese people leaving China for tourism.
That's right. That's right. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars just on that, making them number 1. The second part, though, is this is a marketplace network effects business, and so actually more than 50% of our travelers going to destinations in Asia are coming from China. And so by attracting Chinese guests from China, we're actually helping to grow our business in Japan, in Thailand, throughout Asia. And so it's a critical complement to our success more broadly in Asia.
So take a moment and give us an overview of the business metrics of your China business specifically.
Well, we really break it out into two parts. There's the outbound part and there's the domestic part, and we've really sequenced them that way, first focusing on the outbound part. To date, we've had about 8.6 million guests use Airbnb to go abroad from China since we've started. Domestically, we have 120,000 homes in China. We've had about 2.25 million guests stay in those homes in the last year, a million just in Q3 alone. That has grown about 268% year over year over this past year.
In the United States, when Airbnb started, it was not obvious what Airbnb was. The company had to do a fair amount of education how to do Airbnb, starting with young people, obviously. Was there a similar challenge in China, or was the fact that it existed already, did that make it easier?
No, I think there definitely is a real kind of education curve and kind of proving of the concept. It does require a great deal of trust to engage in this. It's not just knowing what it is, but it's also hearing positive testimony from friends and family. And so it does take a while to get that flywheel going. Frankly, we weren't sure it was going to work here. It wasn't until the end of 2013 that we decided to make the leap. We had certainly heard all the stories from other tech companies about how hard it is to succeed in China, and so we just we weren't sure we should make it a priority, whether we should maybe focus on other things that were more straightforward. But we took the leap in 2014, initially focusing on outbound. We thought that plays to our strength. No local company can do that. But what we've seen is organically a very robust domestic business develop, particularly in the last 2 years. Basically what happens is Chinese travelers go abroad, they experience Airbnb that way, they have a favorable experience, they come back to China, and oftentimes the guests become hosts. This is a C2C model primarily.
Consumer to consumer.
Consumer to consumer. And so the consumer guest can become the consumer host. And so organically, these 120,000 homes across China have basically materialized over the last 2 years. I just shared the stat that in Q3 we had 1 million guests stay in China. 3 years ago, that number was just 10,000. So that's a 100x increase in the last 3 years for Airbnb domestically in China.
It occurs to me our conference is partly about cross-cultural learning in a commercial sense. Airbnb in China is a massive cross-cultural project because you're helping people in one country travel to many other countries. Take a moment and go a little bit into the weeds on what that means. You have to do translation, you have to do customer service, you have to do marketing.
Yeah, I think one of actually the biggest enablers of our business here in China has been localization of the product. I can't stress how important that has been for our success here. We've done a lot of things, but that has had the biggest measurable impact. There's a few reasons why for that. China is a huge market, has its own internet ecosystem, and there's just a lot of Western products that don't work here, Facebook, Google, et cetera. And so much of our site was dependent on those technologies. So we really had to decouple that stuff and basically localize the product for payments, mobile app store, social media integration, performance. And it would be not uncommon to make one of these changes and get a double-digit improvement in conversion. Specifically payment was probably the biggest win when we put the Alipay into the product. We saw a double-digit lift in conversion and bookings, and I think today it's more than half of our bookings are paid via that local integration. So I think it's incredibly important. To that end, we actually now have a product team in Beijing. It's our only product team outside of the United States, and it's about 60 people right now, but we have plans to triple it in the new year.
And what were you doing before Alipay?
Well, before it was just what we have globally, which is MasterCard, Visa, PayPal. Those. That
wasn't cutting it in China, I'm guessing.
It was working, but it's worked so much better, and that's the thing you don't realize. You don't realize how much you're leaving on the table until you actually try it, and it's been eye-opening.
Talk about your unique approach. Well, unique for Airbnb, your approach to customer service in China and with Chinese people.
Yeah, I think there's a few things we're doing differently in China. One is on the product side and putting extra emphasis on the localization. Another thing is our emphasis on customer service. We think that consumers here just have a much higher expectation for how they get helped. They expect help. There's a lot of new things happening here. Cost of labor is different, and so they expect to be able to pick up the phone or chat or whatever and get instant service and be helped. So to that regard, we are building up a local call center that's well staffed. We're also making sure our SLAs in China are more aggressive than our global SLAs. And we're just making sure that we take care of customers because we know our reputation in this market is so important. We know that when things go wrong, it can get out of hand, it can go viral. And so we're really taking a more hands-on approach and investing more into making sure customers are having good experiences.
So I'm a tourist from Guangzhou and I'm visiting Chicago, a beautiful city in the United States, and I've got a problem with my Airbnb. I pick up the phone, I call someone, I want to speak to somebody in Chinese. Where is that person that I'm calling?
Yeah, that person in the future will be in China. Right now, that person is out of the country. You'll still get a Mandarin speaker, but the investment we're making and we'll have online soon will be a native Chinese speaker here in China. Regardless of where you are in the world, you'll be helped by someone local here.
Talk about the local competition. Who are they and how are and what are their pros and cons versus Airbnb's?
There's a number of local competitors here in China. I'd say some of the big differences between how we've approached the market is one of the things I'd just make as a generalization is that the local Chinese companies can always move faster than the outsider. They're always willing to spend more money than the outsider, and they're always able to raise more money than the outsider. And so when we—
Hang on, able to raise more money than the giant Airbnb?
Well, they're willing to spend more money, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And also raise a lot to support that spending. We made sure that when we approached the market that our success was not dependent on that. We made sure that we were going to play to our strengths. The most obvious strength we have is that global network of 4 million homes in 191 countries. So we were really focused on the outbound market, and that's really all we really did for a couple of years. Organically, we've had a very robust domestic business grow as a result of word of mouth. If you look at some of our differences today, now that we have a domestic business, what you'll see is we are much more consumer to consumer. So we rely a lot less on professionals. That's a result of our business growing organically here, as opposed to taking a more of a business development approach in approaching professionals. I would also say that being an outsider in some ways, I think, has helped a little bit with the brand. I think there's a lot of credibility attached to being, having an American brand, and this is an activity that requires a lot of trust. And so I think there is a certain level of trust and credibility that comes with that foreign brand that might not be intuitive at first, but I think has also helped.
You made an interesting throwaway comment almost that in the rest of the world, Google, Facebook, and other companies like that are very important to Airbnb's growth. Not here in China. The conventional wisdom is that a US internet company can't make it in China, and yet you are. Why?
Well, listen, we are not a media or content company. We're really actually a hospitality company that's enabled by the internet. But the service we provide is hospitality. So, we don't run aground of some of those controversial issues that others might. The second part is, I'd say, actually the government has been very supportive of what we do, broadly speaking. President Xi Jinping, in his New Era vision, has called out the importance of not just the digital economy, but specifically the sharing economy, and identified that as an important driver of economic and social development for the country. So it's great to have that kind of high-level national recognition of the importance of these new business models. That, in turn, at the local level, has led to a lot of enthusiasm by municipalities to embrace new models. I'd say here in China, one of the big differences I see relative to the rest of the world is there's so much enthusiasm for new models. You don't see that elsewhere. Elsewhere, when you work with government, it's always about, how do we transition from the old to the new, but it's a much more kind of cautious approach to new business models. In China, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm. In that regard, we've signed about a dozen memorandums of understandings with different governments. So here in Guangzhou, we have a MOU with the government, Shenzhen, Chengdu, Pudong. So we have seen great cooperation with the government. I think we solve some acute issues here, such as the fact that there's 80 million vacant homes in China. And so, I think I think that is also why we're being so successful. We really speak to kind of the national and even a local agenda.
Anyone who visits China from North America notices all the construction cranes here, and you're saying that's the result of them. Before I go to the floor, very briefly tell everybody, not everyone in the room might be familiar with something that Airbnb has called experiences. Tell everyone what it is and what you're doing with them in China.
Yeah, with experiences, historically you think of Airbnb, you think about accommodation, people renting out extra room in their homes or their entire homes. And now we're letting people take whatever it is that they are passionate about, a hobby, for example, and turning that into an experience that they can market to travelers. So for example, you could be into hiking or into cooking, and you can turn that into a 2 or 3 hour experience that you market to a small group of 5 to 10 people at a time. And it's a way to make some extra income, meet people from around the world. For the travelers, it's a way to meet a local person while having a bit of an icebreaker, something that is a mutual interest. So this product is, we have 3,000 experiences live around the world in about 40 markets. We have we also have it in Shanghai, and in the new year we'll be growing that rapidly. We launched it about a year ago, so we've grown about 20x since the start of the year.
Have you done an experience here in China?
Not in China. We only have it in Shanghai. Most recently, I did some experiences in Bangkok. So I did Thai kickboxing, which is awesome. And I also did a cooking experience. We went to the market and then went back to the host's home and cooked the meal together and ate.
That sounds like a lot of fun. And very quickly, Nate, why did you take on the role as chairman of Airbnb China? And why are you racking up so many air miles coming here?
Yeah, I mean, how we've tackled the China market has evolved. The natural starting place was we had folks on the global team who understood China, who are Chinese, just trying to help us get ahead. Very quickly, the advice you get is that you need to have a local team on the ground and have them empowered. And so we moved in that direction. We have a local team in Beijing, and we hired strong local leadership. And so we had an empowered team. That being said, in our business, there is one tech platform. We can't take the China tech and completely separate it from the global platform. And so there is this inherent interconnectedness. And when you empower the local team, you still need to bring to bear the resources of the global organization. And so no one is better positioned to do that than a founder who can both intimately understand what's happening on the ground in China with one leg and say, you have permission to do things differently and go do it, as well as saying, when you need the help of the global organization, I can have my other leg with the global organization and go and be persuasive with them. And so, we think this is the optimal solution for getting the best of both worlds.
You can learn the culture in the country, you can teach the culture of the company when you come.
Yeah, you have to be both intimately familiar with what's happening on the ground locally, but also still have that global context.
Let's have a question, please. Raise your hand. There's one right over here, and so we can have a mic. A mic can come to you. Right behind you, sir. Just tell us who you are, please.
Okay, George Yip from Imperial College Business School in London. What is your percentage of complaints, refunds, and insurance payouts in China compared with the USA? Simple question.
Yeah, I don't know the statistics specifically. I'm not sure it's any materially different. What I will say related to that topic is something we pay a lot more attention to in China is just quality control and fraud. We see a lot of gaming of coupons and any kind of incentive you throw out there. Before you know it, you'll have an army of people trying to game that incentive. And so we do put a lot of extra emphasis on not letting that happen.
Is there one more? We have one right up front, please. And this young lady is going to come quickly. Just tell us who you are, please.
Sure, I'm an Airbnb host from Shanghai, and I'm really interested about how do you think about the difference between Chinese company, Chinese competing company with Airbnb? Just like Xiaozhu or Tujia.com, they not only about a platform, they also to apply a lot of people about customer service, just like room service. How do you think about this? Will be a challenge for Airbnb to come to China? Thank you.
I think what you're saying is that a lot of the local companies offer a lot of services to help people to be hosts. There's a lot of on-the-ground services and hand-holding, things like cleaning and property management. I think the local companies have moved fast and are trying a lot of different things. It's a little unclear how critical some of those services are and whether those services need to be centrally managed on one extreme versus simply helping hosts to find those service providers in a more decentralized way, which is what happens everywhere else in the world. I think you'll also see an ecosystem of other companies form to help meet those same needs. So I agree it's a real need, and I think there's different ways to solve it. I think the local companies have leaned into that more and said, we're going to manually solve this, but it's not clear you need to do it that way. And it's also not clear the economics support that.
That was my very last, what I was interpreting what you were saying, you came to it, is that the profit margins might not be as good with the way he's describing compared to your approach.
Yeah, I think the challenge in China market is a lot of companies take a very hands-on approach, a very heavy approach, which comes with cost. And yet, when you look at the domestic business, the unit economics are very different than the outbound business. Unit economics, I really mean the average daily rate, what people are paying per night. So on outbound, they're paying the kind of the global rate, which is one thing, say $100 a night roughly. Domestically, though, that rate's going to be a fraction of that.
Nate, before you go, I need to put you on the spot. Are you staying here at the Four Seasons in Guangzhou, or are you staying in an Airbnb?
I almost always stay at Airbnbs, but because of security, they have me on site. Which I was just telling my colleague, in the last 2 days, I've stayed at more hotels than I have in, I think, the last 2 years, because I was just at Wuzhen before this, and they also had me kind of on site.
Well, we all make accommodations for these types of things. Do you think you could wrangle a venue for us to hold a global forum or a Brainstorm Tech International in an Airbnb instead of in a hotel?
I can definitely make that happen. So let's talk afterwards. I got something in mind.
And very last point, I want to make sure I read something correctly, that Airbnb believes that China will be its largest origin market by 2020. That's close to almost only 2 years away.
Yeah. Well, I think that is definitely the way it should be long term. When you just look at the market size, China is the largest travel market, both outbound and domestically. So really big markets, and if you look at our trajectory, I think that is quite plausible. China has been our fastest growing country now for about 3 years running. I mentioned that 100x increase over the last 3 years, and so I think that's quite doable.
It's an astounding story. Nate, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.